that cheery note, I'm very happy to introduce our last speaker, who is the Ronald Reagan Distinguished Fellow Emeritus at the Heritage Foundation. I can't have to catch a car, so thanks again. Thank you very much. The Ronald Reagan Distinguished Fellow Emeritus at the Heritage Foundation. You all, of course, know him because of his very close association with Ronald Reagan, going back to the California Governor's Mansion in 1966, and then later as second Attorney General in Ronald Reagan's second term. At Heritage, he built and created the Center for Legal and Judicial Studies, which I'm now happy to say is the Edwin Meese III Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at Heritage Foundation, headed up by David Addington, who's here this afternoon. He is the most decent man I've ever worked with, and I'm honored to be associated with him. And when it comes to first principles and many other things going on in this country, he is someone for whom we should be grateful. Ed Meese.
Thank you, Matt, for your very generous introduction. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your warm welcome. It's a real honor for me to be here with this distinguished panel of friends for a long time and people who really understand our republic. You know, Stan's story about the little girl reminded me of another one that I heard. It had to do with a situation that took place early in the month of February of this year. Father was sitting at his breakfast table, and his daughter came down dressed in a sloppy sweatshirt with jeans with a lot of holes in them, and he was quite concerned. She said, "Susie, what's going on here? You're going to be late for school. You got to go back and get dressed." She says, "Oh, don't worry, Dad. There's no school today. It's President's Day." So the father said, testing this little sixth grader, said, "Susie, do you know what President's Day is?" And Susie said, "Yes, it's kind of like Groundhog's Day." The father was really confused. Said, "What do you mean?" "Well, it's like this, Dad. It's the day when President Obama comes out of the White House, and if he sees his shadow, we have another year of unemployment." But we're talking about first principles. And the first principles that have been very well discussed here basically are those that are enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution by some very wise founders, as you heard, who were carefully prepared through their education and through their thinking to do what they could to institutionalize and preserve for the foreseeable future the idea of freedom, which is the basis, of course, for this republic. Well, it's unfortunate that we have seen, particularly in the past century, considerable erosion of that freedom, and because of that, it is because of the erosion of those first principles. It began really in earnest about literally 100 years or 1 century ago with the people who called themselves progressives and who hated the Constitution because they said it was an obstacle to what they could do for the people of America. But they really meant it was an obstacle to what they wanted to do based upon their own rather strange philosophy of statism and the kinds of things that could only be done by essentially a powerful central government. And so as a result, 1913, just 1 century ago, was a bad year for the Constitution. That was the year we got the income tax giving the central government its greatest ability to fund itself, and we also got a change in the way in which senators were elected. Before that, they were elected by the various states, and so that preserved the balance between the states and the federal government in terms of power. And when we had the direct election of senators, that took away then the ability of having them responsible basically to their states, which prior to that time were elected, they were elected through the state legislature, and instead they now were responsible to themselves only and to the electorate they represented, a very different picture than what the founders had intended. And of course today we have the continued erosion, perhaps right now more pronounced than I've seen it during my lifetime. We have a Congress, for example, where the former speaker, when asked about the constitutionality of one of the most important pieces of legislation which had the most to do with the oppression of the people, namely Obamacare, when asked whether that was constitutional, her reply is to the person who asked, "Are you serious? You know, what does the Constitution have?" In essence, she was saying to whether or not we have a particular piece of legislation. And this was the Congress also that in many ways, even today, within this week, where a senator seeking to impose a piece of legislation that has some real ramifications concerning its being consistent with the Second Amendment, when challenged by a hypothetical question about the Constitution, essentially refused to ask and gave a hyperbolic response to the other senator asking the question. In terms of the president, we have a president today who ignored the Constitution when he made a series of recess appointments when there was no recess. He evaded the Constitution by appointing a bunch of people known as czars who had authority normally reserved for cabinet officers who had to answer questions before the Senate and their confirmation process, and then through to both houses of Congress for their activities when in office. He trashed the Constitution, and particularly checks and balances, when he waived the work requirement for welfare recipients, despite a specific congressional enacted law against doing such a thing. And he shredded the Constitution when he essentially granted amnesty to a whole category of people in terms of illegal aliens without any congressional authorization. And then we've had the judiciary that likewise has done its bit to violate essentially the founders' concepts and those initial and those important first principles. We had a Chief Justice who only recently used a convoluted approach and, in my opinion, abuse of the Constitution to justify one of the greatest legislative acts of oppression of the people. That, of course, again, was Obamacare. And we had a court, by a 5-4 vote, that invalidated government by the people by overturning an initiative by the people of Colorado when they specifically passed an initiative by a majority of the people themselves which affirmed God's definition of marriage and tried to make sure that the laws of Colorado conformed to that definition. Well, I believe that that is why it is critical that as we stand here at CPAC 2013, a location, a venue where the conservative movement and those who believe in the Constitution and the Declaration have traditionally mounted their efforts, as Ronald Reagan asked them to do in 1975 and in many of the other remarks that he made over the years. And that's why I believe that the reason that the overwhelming majority of the people in the United States believe we're on the wrong track is that we have indeed abandoned or violated those important first principles that the founders developed. And that's why, in order to change and to move in a different direction, we need to use this as a starting point to mobilize conservatives throughout the country, in all parties that we can find them. And indeed, I think that the Reagan Democrats indicated to us that it's not just a one-party situation, but rather that when you really go back to something that resonates with the people in terms of protecting and regaining their freedom, that we find people across the partisan spectrum. And that's why the Tea Party, in my opinion, Tea Party groups have been so effective, is finding ordinary people. Many of them were, in fact, members of another party or independents who have banded together to restore the kind of a government that the founders initially established on the basis of the first principles. That's why we need to be sure that in 2014 we elect a Congress in both houses that is committed to those first principles, and we need to hold their feet to the fire after we have elected those members of Congress in both houses so that they will live up on the floor of the two houses to what they said during the election. We need to elect a president in 2016 who will fully fulfill the Constitution through his own actions and will also appoint judges to the courts who indeed will uphold constitutional fidelity and not judicial activism. And thirdly, we need to speak out in every instance that we can when the court does, when judges do engage in judicial activism. Believe it or not, judges are somewhat influenced by what the public thinks. And it's important that through letters to the editor, through other pronouncements, through positions of organizations and the like, that when the court goes wrong, we speak out and ask that the judiciary likewise be faithful to the Constitution. These are the things that I think, as a movement and as people who have indicated by their presence here in this hall, have signified their concern for the country and their wish to do something better and to have a better country. We can't wait for another Ronald Reagan. There are going to be other people that will likewise pick up the banner and carry it forward. We have a strong bench, as has been talked about here, among the governors and among many of the people now in the Congress itself. But we each have a responsibility to do what we can in order to make this come about. I believe that we can use the political first principles that have been talked about by speakers here and use that to regain the philosophical and constitutional first principles established by the founders. And if we can do that, we will take back our country and restore the freedom that the founders gave us. Thank you.